Existe toda uma nova economia que valoriza os ativos da natureza que já está surgindo, ela já existe. Uma das coisas que fica muito claro conforme a gente organiza a COP30 e vai avançando nessa esforço de aceleração de implementação de soluções, é entender que essa economia já precisa ganhar escala. Mas ela está aí. Por exemplo, quando a gente fala sobre soluções baseadas na natureza, no meio urbano, a gente esteve recentemente na África, em Addis Abeba, e você vê o reflorestamento acontecendo nas cidades em todas as partes. Isso é uma economia que entende os limites planetários, é uma economia que valoriza esses ativos naturais, e essa revolução, digamos, da forma como a gente lida com a natureza, ela já está acontecendo. Mas ela precisa avançar ainda mais. E para avançar, ela precisa de escala. Para conseguir escala, ela precisa de colaboração. Então, diferentes instituições têm que estar juntas nesse esforço de entender como cada ecossistema, cada cidade, cada território consegue desenvolver novos modelos econômicos usando esses recursos naturais que estão ali colocados. Isso é um pouco o chamado que a gente tem falado na COP30 do mutirão. O mutirão é um esforço para mostrar que as soluções para os problemas vêm dessa colaboração, vêm dessa complementariedade entre diferentes capacidades, diferentes recursos, diferentes áreas de conhecimento, e só assim a gente vai conseguir construir uma economia que seja resiliente, que aumente a resiliência dos ecossistemas e da sociedade e que também ajude na descarbonização da economia global. A gente não tem tempo a perder, a urgência é grande, mas as soluções estão aí. O importante é investir mais nelas.
Now, Bernice Lee is going to return to stage in a conversation with Julie McCarthy on the topic of bioeconomy. This is a rapidly emerging field, important globally, but especially here in our country, home to 20% of the world's biological diversity. Julie is the CEO of Nature Finance and has over 20 years' experience in nonprofit and philanthropic leadership in the fields of economic justice, development finance, and corporate accountability. Bernice, you know already her, chairs the advisor board of the Chatham House Sustainability Accelerator and also the board of the event hosts Bellwethers Group. She serves on numerous nonprofit and for-profit boards and is a frequent media commentator on the geopolitical implications of the nature and climate debates. So, welcome again, Bernice, and the stage is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Simone, for a very kind introduction. But I thought that it's probably not particularly nice because the first thing I wanted to say, though, is that you put me on stage with my boss because I'm also an advisor to Nature Finance. But more importantly, perhaps, I think I want to sort of quickly say that the question today is, can an emerging bioeconomy save nature? But I suspect what we should be saying is, can an emerging bioeconomy save the world, including nature and climate? Now, with that in mind, Julie, would you like to tell us more about what you think is the bioeconomy challenge? Today, of course, is no longer just a niche thing. It is a frontier, but not niche. 50 countries or more have bioeconomy strategies. Maybe we should start with nature finance. Would you tell us a bit more about nature finance and what it does?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for being here. This is a very daunting title, a lot to put on the bioeconomy, but we do have very high expectations for it. So we'll see what it can deliver. So I'm Julie McCarthy. I'm CEO of Nature Finance. We are a global nonprofit solutions lab that is focused on trying to align finance with an economy that works for nature, climate, and people. We are motivated by the reality that right now more than $7 trillion per annum is actively destroying nature each year. So that's about 7% of global GDP each year that is directly harming nature. And so there are many wonderful initiatives out there and that we're all hearing about this week that are trying to raise the 200 billion that's required to meet conservation goals, which is hugely important work. And at the same time, Nature Finance focuses its efforts very much on trying to take this harmful activity and shift it in the real economy into more nature positive outcomes.
Brilliant. Well, in which case, can you tell us more about the goals and challenges of this bioeconomy challenge that we have in front of us?
Yes. So let me first just maybe give um, our explanation of how we think about the concept of bioeconomy, because bioeconomy can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So our definition of it, and kind of the working definition within the context of the G20, for example, over the past few years in their global bioeconomy initiative, is basically the sustainable regenerative use of bio-based resources in any economic system. So when a lot of people hear bioeconomy, depending on your context, you might think of like the small scale fruit and nut economy, or you may think of biofuels, but it is a much bigger umbrella and landscape than that. So we understand it to include everything from very nature intensive activities like regenerative agriculture, aquaculture, sustainable aquaculture, um, ecotourism, nature credits, nutraceuticals, all the way through to more advanced technologies like bioplastics, bio-based textiles and materials for construction, biofuels, of course, and then through to the very high-tech end of the spectrum where you're looking at things like biotechnology, lab-grown protein, controlled environment, agriculture, things of that sort. So it's a very wide spectrum of activity. And it's funny, I was in a regional trade convening last week in the Caribbean in St. Lucia on the bioeconomy. It was a trade bioeconomy finance discussion, and the head of agriculture and agro-industrial activity for the CARICOM Secretariat got up on stage and he said, you know, I was invited to this meeting and I couldn't understand what's this bioeconomy thing and why am I being invited to be here? And then, you know, I read about it and I realized like these are exactly the things we're trying to do. We're trying to build sustainable, regenerative, equitable systems that valorize our natural wealth. And all of a sudden he turned into a big bioeconomy champion. The reality is a lot of people are doing bioeconomy activity, but may not be conceptualizing it as such. So to get to the bioeconomy challenge with that understanding of this big landscape of activity and really a kind of alternative, sustainable, regenerative economic paradigm that we're trying to accomplish here, about 2 years ago, under Brazil's leadership of the G20, they decided to establish something called the Global Bioeconomy Initiative. So it was basically the first kind of formal space within the G20 to look at the role of nature explicitly as part of broader green economic transition. And through that process, Brazil led the group to establish these 10 high-level principles for the bioeconomy, looking at things like trade, looking at things like socio-bioeconomy and finance, and a really wide spectrum of issues. The government of South Africa then, during this past year in its presidency, took on the working group again, continued this agenda, took some of the high-level principles, especially those focused on trade, on finance, on data and metrics, understanding what sustainable versus unsustainable bioeconomy activity looks like, because there's a lot of unsustainable use of bio-based resources as well, and made a lot of progress with that group in carrying forward the agenda and trying to identify mainly barriers. I would say there's more progress on barriers to scaling the bioeconomy than solutions, which is still, you know, a step forward in terms of moving the agenda. So fast forward to the past several months, and the government of Brazil recognizing that there was a tremendous amount of political momentum accumulating within the G20 process around the bioeconomy, and also recognizing that we're not sure what's going to happen with the bioeconomy working group in this year's G20 with the US presidency, in an extraordinary act of leadership, decided to create a new multilateral initiative that's going to be launched at COP30 on November 17th called the Bioeconomy Challenge. And the Bioeconomy Challenge is a 3-year multilateral effort with government, civil society, private sector that's going to focus on taking these 10 high-level principles that I mentioned and actually bringing them to life in the real world over the next few years. There's going to be 4 working groups focused on metrics and data, finance, market development, and socio-bioeconomy. And Nature Finance is going to serve as the global secretariat for the effort. And our hope is that we use the opportunity to really drive forward some ambitious progress over the next few years.
But, I mean, it's definitely is fascinating to think that there's a power in an idea, because a lot of what happened in the last decade is about what happens in the energy economy. And Brazil is very explicitly saying that it should also be about what happens in the land economy. So I was just sort of interested in thinking through, if it is about the power of an idea, what are the kind of good things that we could see happening if you really, truly embrace the concept of bioeconomy? And what would we do differently if we really do that?
So it's a great question, and just to build on your point a little bit, a lot of people, I think, that when they hear a green economic transition, automatically their minds go to renewable energy and decarbonization, specifically around oil and gas emissions in particular, and methane. And there's a huge role for nature to play in green economic transition as well, and in decarbonization. The bioeconomy is a big part of that. In terms of examples of what good could look like, I'll give a few just from my travels in the past year or so, engaging with stakeholders in the bioeconomy. So you could look at the sugarcane industry in South Africa. So very happily, people around the world are starting to consume less and less sugar because we're realizing it's not the greatest for human health. And that has been having a devastating impact on the South African sugar industry. And these sugar mills are the heart of communities. They are central to their livelihoods. And to date, South Africa has largely been an exporter of raw, unprocessed sugar. So now they are exploring basically a valorization approach within the bioeconomy to sugar, where they take that sugar and they turn it into bioplastics, and they turn it into advanced polymers, which add a tremendous amount of value, keep obviously the jobs within these communities, and create a whole new set of export markets and innovation within that economy. Another example would be from the Caribbean, where I just was, where they're dealing with sargassum right now. So they have these huge sargassum blooms because of global warming, and they are toxic, they are huge carbon emitters, they are not good for tourism, and people coming looking for a nice beach view and seeing these huge blooms of sargassum. And so they are now trying to develop a strategy where they can capture the sargassum, clean it, bleach it, process it, and turn it into carrageenan and sea moss gel and different kinds of thickeners and nutraceuticals for export. I actually have St. Lucian sea moss in my refrigerator. I try and take it every morning. It's very good for your health. And at the same time, you can get carbon emission avoidance credits from removing the sargassum and preventing the decomposition of it. And you can also use it for biogas. So some of the local hotels are starting to use it for biogas as well. There's one other example which I found really exciting as an opportunity and a
So that's great. So it's both a kind of way to make money differently in some ways, but also to replace stuff that we don't think we want anymore, right?
Or to substitute for really expensive imports that are unsustainable. So one great example there would be biofertilizer, for example. So you can use biomass from farm waste to turn it into biochar and biofertilizer, and that's much less expensive and much better for the climate. The other example I was going to give was in the Caribbean. Right now they import all of their shrimp for all of the fancy hotels where tourists come to stay. And there have been studies done that they have the perfect environment for both onshore and offshore aquaculture, sustainable aquaculture for shrimp. They haven't done it yet. And interestingly, there's a whole group of female farmers who are very interested to do this, but they need the government support. And that's one piece that I would just highlight here, that there's no substitute, as in all things, for political leadership within government. So like in the Caribbean, they were just discussing the CARICOM industrial policy, and not in one place did they mention nature or the bioeconomy. And without that kind of explicit prioritization, you end up privileging in different ways all of the sort of dirty carbon intensive inputs instead of the sustainable substitutes that you want. There's all of these kind of silent ways where the lack of a government strategy and priority to substitute bio-based for fossil-based products can really sort of act counter to everybody's interests for no good reason. So we're hoping that the bioeconomy challenge is an opportunity to really bring that to the surface and help governments to exert more intentional leadership around bioeconomy strategies.
I mean, I think it sounds great, and in fact, partly because of Julie's influence, I just wrote a paper recently with your support as well on how do we change from solar to soil in some ways and think about it the same way, and in terms of the future economic competitiveness for for any countries really. At the same time, if it sounds so great, why are we not there yet? What's stopping us?
Oh my gosh, there's so many reasons. You know, I think that first and foremost, you have the ease and convenience of incumbent products, like plastics is a great example. There was a company in Switzerland 2 years ago that was just on the cusp of converting from single-use plastics across their global supply chains to bio-based plastics. And then they realized that their profit margin would drop from $7 to 50 cents. And so that's a real cost. And it's, you know, renewables is a great example here, because with renewable energy in Germany, for example, you had a feed-in tariff where you basically had the government subsidizing for a period renewables to be able to compete with a much less expensive, much dirtier alternative, until eventually the technology and the economies of scale and everything caught up, where now, as we know, renewables are often cheaper than fossil fuels. And so for many of these cases where you have a non-bio-based incumbent product, like a plastic, for example, you're going to need government incentives and leadership in the early stages. And that can look like many things. It can look like taxes. It could look like strategic public procurement for all of the hospitals and jails, and, you know, all of the ways in which the purchasing power of a government can be leveraged to seed industries. So that's definitely a challenge. I think metrics are another challenge for investors as well, to know what good versus bad looks like, to be able to verify sustainable versus unsustainable. I think that we're on the cusp of a lot of innovation in that domain, and that's one of the primary areas the bioeconomy challenge is going to focus on. And then the other piece I would mention is just capacity. So one example that I love that testifies to this, there's a wonderful story about Cape Town's water crisis in South Africa, and they were about to reach day 0 and have no water available for an enormous city. And so the Development Bank of Southern Africa and others came together, and they did all of these studies to figure out what was the best infrastructure solution for this. And they looked at desalination, they looked at drilling deeper aquifers, and they ended up choosing the elimination of invasive species as the strategy. Because it was just as effective as all of the sort of gray hard infrastructure solutions, and it was 12 times cheaper. And it also had all of these co-benefits for biodiversity and employment, et cetera. And in having this discussion about this water bond with a group of multilateral and public development banks, the reaction was, oh, if only we had that kind of analytic capacity within our project origination units. We don't even have people asking these questions right now, let alone being able to analyze, you know, the green infrastructure approaches versus others from an economic perspective. So I think there's a generation of kind of upskilling that needs to take place as well, and can happen pretty fast, I think.
I mean, I definitely think that you very seamlessly took us from nature as mitigation to some extent to nature as resilience. And this is, in fact, a very good bridge. At the same time, we also hear, you know, for many years, challenge of scaling nature-based solution is that there's worry about ultimately lead to unsustainable use on the other side because of all the guardrails on the ground. So how do you think that the capacity need that you talk about, for example, would need to be sort of balanced between all the different types of capacity building that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really challenging issue, and it's one where there is enormous capacity. I mean, there's certain sectors, of course, of the bioeconomy, like biocement and biosteel and bioplastics, that have a big kind of industrial component to it. But a lot of bioeconomy activity is very small scale within communities, often indigenous and local populations who are driving it. And in those instances right now, the biggest challenge that I encounter that a lot of these MSMEs, these micro and small enterprises face, is access to finance. I mean, even where these loans technically exist within financial institutions, you have a female farmer going in because she wants to turn her goat milk into a goat milk soap enterprise rather than just raw consumption, and being told that, you know, she has to leave double the collateral down for a loan, and, you know, walks out with no sense of how she's ever going to find the money to do this. And that's such a common story. And you have increasingly, you know, a larger number of these funds that are ostensibly available to invest in bioeconomy activity, but there's a bridging gap in between the even like the 5 million down to the 11,000 that's needed, which adds up in small communities to an entire local economy. So I think that we're going to need more bridging facilities that are translating big ambitions and big numbers into real implementation, with a lot of stakeholders on the ground that have already, for decades, if not hundreds of years, been using sustainable practices because they need to regenerate all the resources in their community that they rely on to do the activities that they're doing. And the other piece I would say is that I think 5 years ago, you could have made the argument that it was nearly impossible for a big multinational supply chain to understand what's happening sort of down to the local level from a sustainability perspective. And now with the advent of remote sensing and satellite technology and blockchain and all of the incredible project development we've seen, especially related to nature credits, of late, there's so many tools available to be deployed, even for governments that don't have huge data and analytic capacity in-house. There are a lot of free tools that can be deployed to leverage. So I think that's really promising.
I mean, I think it's very persuasively, you just convinced us that we need a 100 flowers bloom situation. So as we look to the next week, if not next year, let's start with next week in Berlin. If for the right signals to be sent, what would you like to see as we come to almost the last 2 minutes of our session here? What do you think is the best case scenario from your perspective that you want to see from Berlin, that people in this room perhaps can help us send the messages out there? We heard all these brilliant communicators here in this room who will understand better as well how to tell the story from their perspective. So what is the thing you want to see? Give them a vision that we can all aspire to.
So I'll say, first of all, that the fact that nature and the bioeconomy feature at this COP in the way that they're featuring is nothing short of remarkable. It's taken 30 COPs for this to happen in this way, and for nature and climate to be seen holistically as sort of part of this two sides of the same coin. So I think we're already sort of making progress in transformational ways there. For me, I think this bioeconomy challenge opportunity, having done some of these multi-stakeholder initiatives before, they are what you make of them. So if we use this opportunity to get all of the right governments and all of the right project developers and financial institutions and civil society stakeholders in the room and come up with their most ambitious ideas, we can really make tremendous progress even in this wild geopolitical environment that we're in right now, because it's all about coalitions of the willing. And so I think spreading the word about this opportunity and making sure that stakeholders that you know that you think would find value in a community like this that is looking for very pragmatic, action-oriented progress on bioeconomy initiatives over the next few years to steer them in the direction of the bioeconomy challenge, I think that would be a big win. To emerge from that gathering in Berlin, not just with a group of people who happen to be on the inside and have heard of this by word of mouth, but with a group of stakeholders that have been looking for a community to help answer these very specific challenges that have been barriers to them scaling bioeconomy in their own particular regions and countries.
I love that Brazil, in some ways, has pressed play.
Yes.
Now the rest of us have to start playing, and then we can see where we get to. So thank you very much, Julie.
Yes, pleasure. Nice to be here. Thank you.